welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Mat Duerden, it is a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, I'm really excited for the conversation. Thanks for the invitation.
We met not that long ago, and there's this amazing thing when you meet someone who you feel like you probably should have met decades ago. And that is definitely the way that I felt. As soon as I met you, I was like, where have you been all of my life? This is so wonderful to be able to have you in my world.
Oh, thanks. I felt the same way. And it's one of those conversations, our initial conversations, where you then look forward to subsequent follow-up conversations. And so I'm really excited that we can chat in this format today.
Well, and maybe just to jump right in, maybe you can tell folks a little bit about yourself and what your connection to meaningful work is, maybe what you think, why is work meaningful for you?
Sure. So I am a professor of experience design and management in the Marriott School of Business at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. So there's like the full sort of official line there. I'm interested in both in terms of research and teaching questions around experiences and what makes certain experiences more impactful than others, and how do we intentionally both design experiences, but think about the experiences that we engage in our own lives. And I see, to your question about meaningful work, meaning is derived out of the experiences that we have. And the meaning making is actually what turns an experience from perhaps just ordinary or memorable to meaningful and transformational. And so that work of finding meaning in our lives, for me, extends beyond the boundaries of like work, quote unquote. But what gets me excited is ways in which we can infuse meaning through designed experiences, both in the workplace and outside of work. And so I love to see non-work insights about experience design come into the workplace and vice versa, right? I just see the different domains of our lives as opportunities to find meaning. And I think it's through experiences and intentionally designed experiences that we can up the meaning in those domains.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the reasons why I'm so excited to be able to have you speak on this podcast is because I think that the capacity for people to actually create meaningful work is all about the ways in which we design experiences. My background is actually in theater. So well before I was ever in culture or leadership development or any of the work that positive psychology, any of the work that I do now, I was in theater. And in many ways, theater is all about the design of experience. It's all about the design of an interaction between, an audience and artists who are on stage. And there are so many facets of what it means to be able to design that experience, what a director might call a mise en scène of possibilities, a whole palette of opportunities to think about design. And so, yeah, as I said, one of the reasons why I'm so excited to hear from you is to learn a little bit more about what experience design is all about, and what that actually means in practical terms. So maybe you can help us just start with that. What does experience design actually do?
Yeah, and I'll dip back into what you were talking about in terms of your background in theater, because I think we in the experience design world pull a lot from the theater world, even at a minimum, just in terms of some of the vocabulary. So we think about designing experiences and then staging experiences, recognizing first and foremost that you can't force an experience upon anyone. Experiences are objectively perceived, right? We may go to a workplace and sort of see what people are doing and the responsibilities and actions and conversations that are happening. But also we have to recognize that experiences are also individually subjectively perceived. So we can all go to a meeting and have the same meeting shared experience, but we're going to walk away and each have our own perceptions and tell different stories about that experience because of who we are, our personalities and our backgrounds and the role that we had in the meeting and what we had for breakfast and all these things that make us unique. And so as an experienced designer, we have to take in the fact that all experiences are co-created. I may design and stage a particular experience, but it's going to be up to someone coming, paying attention to that experience, engaging with it. And then hopefully, if it's well designed, we walk away with a story with perceived outcomes that we're both happy with. And so a lot of times we'll talk about a staged experience. We'll think about, do you want participants to be audience members or actors? Are they going to be passive? Or are they going to be on stage, sort of interacting with the experience scape that we've designed for them to interact with? And we're going to talk about things like blocking, how people and things move through an experience, just like you would in a theatrical performance. We'll talk about front stage versus backstage contributors to an experience. Are you someone who's going to interact with somebody in the experience front stage, or are you backstage writing code or developing policies? So there's a lot of that language that comes across, but ultimately it's about designing, orchestrating spaces, whether those be physical or virtual, that will allow people to interact with other people, objects, rules, visual stimuli, hierarchical setups and web pages, whatever they might be, with the hope that through a mixture of both ordinary and extraordinary touch points, people end up in a place, whether that's physically or emotionally or attitudinally, they deem worth their time.
Hmm. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably can't see Matt right now, but he's smiling. You like light up as you talk about experience design. It's a joy.
I like this topic. So yeah.
You just talked about ordinary versus extraordinary experience. Let's do a deeper dive into that. What do you mean by that?
So we have experiences all the time. You could say everything is an experience. You wake up in the morning, as soon as you start paying attention to things, whether that's external stimuli or thinking internally about how you're feeling and what you're thinking, like it's just that stream of consciousness is our experience. Now, most experiences, most things that we pay attention to are pretty fleeting. There's a lot that Daniel Kahneman talks about system 1 and system 2 thinking, or fast and slow thinking. And a lot of times our brain just goes on autopilot, right? We may be driving to work, but we don't really pay attention to how to get there because we've done it so many times. We're tying our shoes. So there's a lot of experiences that the impact is pretty fleeting, which is okay, right? It allows our brains to do other things, and there's efficiency involved there. There are then a subset of experiences that we do actively pay attention to. But even then, many of those are just ordinary. They don't really stick with us. And then there's a smaller subset of experiences that are extraordinary. And there's 3 categories that we talk about and with colleagues do research on. The first being memorable. So these are experiences that are triggered by some type of emotional reaction, positive or negative, but enough that the brain sort of stops and says, okay, let's timestamp this. Something's happening. We've had a reaction. Remember this moment. It becomes memorable. So emotion is that key characteristic. And then if an emotional reaction then leads to some type of heightened cognition or reflection on that experience, and we are able to really unpack it in a way where we find some type of personally relevant insight. So it's not just like I felt joy or sorrow or whatever it might be, that we also be able to see like, oh, wow, this has changed how I view myself or another person or the world around me. That then would be a meaningful experience. And then finally, a transformative experience would involve emotion, some type of personally relevant insight, and change. And that could be like small T transformation, like I like salt and vinegar crisps, or a big T transformation, like I'm going to pursue a new career. Now, all of those have a temporal aspect too. I think most of the time within the moment, it's going to be, if something sort of moves above ordinary to extraordinary, it's going to be because we experience emotion. And it might not be until later, either in the experience or afterwards, that we have time to sort of unpack and think about like, what does this really mean to me? And then is there enough of an insight that it nudges us towards some type of behavioral change? And things that weren't memorable in the moment can become memorable over time as we sort of reflect back on something and think, wow, that last conversation I had with that colleague who then was transferred to another division, that was pretty meaningful. Like I missed those conversations, right? Or we could be like, oh, it's January 1st. I'm totally going to change all of these things. And then 2 weeks later, we don't, right? So I think there are some distinct characteristics, and we've shown this empirically in the research that we've done, that this hierarchy really bears out. It's very unlikely for somebody to say, I've experienced change and not to have foundational insights and emotion attached with that. But those things can change over time. So a lot of the research that I do is trying to understand that and also help people understand that we're not just trying to design extraordinary touch point after extraordinary touch point after extraordinary touch point. We're thinking about sort of a portfolio of different experience types that will allow people to sort of navigate through an experience through many ordinary touch points, just because we have them do sort of functional things that we want them to be easy and seamless, so that when we have a hoped for peak moment, that they have the attention to be able to pay attention to that. So experience design really comes down to thinking about, like, how do we design this flow of ordinary and extraordinary moments in an intentional, orchestrated way?
You just talked about portfolio of touch points that we need to be able to create. And side note here, which is a fun historical fact about Andrew Soren, my mother, Barbara Soren, actually studied transformational museum experience for her PhD
Oh,
about
cool.
40 years ago, which is kind of amazing. And so,
Yeah. And, the museum industry and museum researchers really did a lot of foundational work before anybody was thinking about this type of thing. And so that's really cool. Yeah, I've gained some really great insights out of that literature. Maybe I've even read your mom's stuff. Who knows?
I remember as a small child looking at her PhD dissertation and seeing somebody's name that was 16 characters long and laughing that there might be somebody whose name was so long, and it turns out that man's name was Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who was one of the founders of positive psychology.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Just
Yeah. That's
just
a
the most.
cool connection. That's a fun connection.
But let's unpack this kind of notion of memorable, meaningful, and transformational touch point even further. What would that look like in a work context?
One of the tools that I think is most powerful when it comes to experience design are experience maps. And people call these journey maps or touchpoint maps or service. There's all kinds of different flavors. But at the simplest, you're just trying to chunk an experience down into individual touch points. And I think that the simplest way to think about how you do that is anytime that there is a significant shift in attention in an experience. Maybe you're going to a different web page, a new speaker comes up on stage, you move physically from one place to another. That would be a different touch point. And let's talk about a work experience, right? If I'm a manager and I'm trying to think about the work that people do that report to me, I think, in first place, working collaboratively with them, because it's easy to just sort of impose our perception of what someone's experience is at work, right? It's easy as saying, like, just tell me a story about, like, your typical day at work, right? And start getting a sense of, like, okay, what does that look like? And usually, even in that process, we'll have insights of, like, oh, I always thought you did this and then this, or I thought you felt this way about this. Because once we're able to, and it's oversimplified to say that, like, experience journeys are linear, right? But just as we start to say, like, okay, what does a typical workday look like? And then to also try to understand, okay, what is sort of your reaction, or what are you often saying across these different touch points? Does your day start with a long commute and you get to work and can't find parking? And so you're often in this sort of negative emotional state when you walk in the door. Like, that's important pieces of information. So I think just being able to map out sort of what I would say is a current state map of an experience, and both in terms of what are the touch points and then what are the common reactions to each of these touch points. What that will often do is help you identify where the peaks and pits are in an experience. And a lot of times there's pits that we aren't even aware of, right? Like a bad commute or some type of process that nobody knows why it's set up that way, but we still use it. And it's just laborious or whatever it might be, right? So I think often you identify some like low hanging fruit of like, oh, here's ways we can just make this experience simpler, just like fill in some of these pits. And I think this is important because the service literature shows that if you try to provide an extraordinary experience before just meeting basic sort of experience service expectations, you can make people angry, right? It's better to just like do a good job of the baseline, like sort of service quality things as opposed to like go above and beyond. So just first identifying, okay, how can we make things easier, simplified, more streamlined, which then, even if all the changes is that we've relooked at our parking policy so it's easier for people to find spots when they get on site, that's going to have a trickle down effect in terms of how they experience the rest of their workday because they're not sort of unpacking these negative emotions at the beginning of the day. And then we can start thinking about, okay, like there's multiple stakeholders involved here. We've got our employees, we've got my responsibilities of manager, I've got people above me, we have organizational sort of mission and vision values. Start thinking about, okay, in this sort of ecosystem of all of these things, what do we really want our employee to say at the end of the day? What do we want a manager to say at the end of the day? Like ideally in an aspirational future state, what would we want people saying about their experience at work? And I think being able to articulate specific statements is really helpful because it allows you to have a much more specific design target. And then you can start working back and saying, okay, now let's try to elevate some of these moments. Like, what is it that we can do? And then we can draw on theoretical perspectives. Like positive psych gives us all of these tools, right? We may say, okay, we know like basic psychological needs, autonomy, relatedness, and competence from self-determination theory. How do I just sprinkle more autonomy, more competence, and more relatedness? And not try to change everything, but like, are there touch points throughout the day where I could just tweak some of those? How can I just infuse a little bit more autonomy? And then, as opposed to just stepping back and saying, yeah, we need more autonomy among our workforce, you're then more strategically saying, no, at this point of the day or this point of the workflow, this is where I'm going to do it. It just allows you to be a little bit more surgical once you've mapped out the experience, to think about ways to infuse some extraordinary moments and then just built upon good, well-designed, ordinary touch points.
One of the things that's really standing out for me in what you've just described is also this notion of being able to be, well, when I used to work at a bank, we called it brilliant at the basics for customer experience. Our goal when we worked at the bank was to create customer experiences that were truly delightful, that would define the category of what customer experience might mean. And yet all of those delightful, delighting, extraordinary experiences were kind of null and void, were useless if you didn't just, if the line was too long to be able to get to the
Totally.
If like if you didn't just smile and say their name, like some really basic stuff that you just needed to be able to have before you tried to create everything else.
Yeah, totally. Because like I said, the research bears this out from a variety of different disciplines. You've got to meet those basic promises. If you want something to be meaningful, you've got to provide some positive emotions before you get to that point, or maybe negative emotions, depending on what you're trying to design. But you're absolutely right. It's not just about this like home run experience. It's going to change everybody's lives. No, there's a lot more just like groundwork to really thinking systemically about what's the whole ecosystem and how do we make sure that we're doing the foundational things first. So a lot of, I think, great experienced designers are ones who just pay attention to those small details and have empathy with people to really try to understand what the experience is from their perspective and not just impose your expertise in the situation and just try to solve things that don't need to be solved or you don't have a clear understanding of people's needs. So yeah, I totally agree with you.
Mm-hmm. It also makes me think, again, in the design of an employee experience, we've talked on this podcast with Scott Gray Kaufman. We looked at Maslow, the hierarchy of needs that Maslow presented. And often that's positioned as a pyramid. Scott said a far better way to think about that might be to think about it like a boat, where you have fundamental security needs. And those security needs are like the hull of the boat. Mm-hmm. And you have fundamental growth needs. And those growth needs are like the sails. And if you try to hold the sail without having a boat, you're going to drown. I think about that a lot in organizational context, especially around trying to introduce positive psychology constructs into the workplace. Like, yeah, we want everyone to feel like they can grow and develop and reach their full potential. But if they're not getting paid enough to live, if their schedule is completely unmanageable, if the fundamental criteria of their work is indecent first, if we aren't brilliant at the basics of those kinds of things, working on like, how can we unlock your potential is actually going to make people angry as opposed to be something that's
Yes.
joyful.
Yeah, totally. You're absolutely right. And I think on sort of the flip side of that, it's thinking, okay, we have, let's say, design strategies that we're going to use, whether that's we're going to map out the experience to try to identify, like, are there baseline promises, ordinary experiences that are failing and that need to be done better. But we also want to think about let's say, the experiential competencies of the people who are going to be engaging in these experiences, right? And of course, in a work environment, there's competencies associated with work roles, but I think there's also experiential competencies. For example, you can have an experience that is enjoyable, right? Let's say you could go on a vacation to Italy and enjoy the food and the sights, and it's sort of this aesthetic, enjoyable experience. The experience becomes different if you have done work beforehand. Perhaps you have ancestry in Italy, or you've learned a lot about Italian cuisine, or you've spent time researching the Renaissance. You're going to have a much different experience going to Italy, having this sort of anticipatory work done where the personal relevance of seeing the David for the first time is very different for someone who doesn't know much about it to somebody who like understands the significance of that, right? And suddenly it moves from just something memorable, like I've seen this famous thing that other people have seen, to something meaningful. Like I've seen this icon of the Renaissance and what that meant for the city of Florence, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so taking that back into a work environment, thinking about like what are sort of the anticipatory knowledge and emotions that we want people to have as they come to work here? Did they have a degree of organizational identification where they feel like there's aspects of this organization and the mission and the vision and whatever it is that we're doing that have personal relevance to me? And how do you as an organization help people get to that point where they see not just this is a job to get paid, but there's some type of meaning associated with it? And some of that is you helping people develop what I call the experiential competencies to make those connections beforehand. Because I always think about experiences in terms of you got anticipation, participation, and reflection phases. And an experiential competency that you can think about is storytelling, which is just a form of reflection. What often happens, especially in this day and age when we are inundated with all kinds of calls for our attention, right? Like you finish one show on Netflix and the next one pops back up. You finish one news story and it takes you to another place, the YouTube. So there's very little time. Like our digital world has been created in a way where reflection is just not taken into consideration. And the literature is pretty clear that reflection isn't something that most of us naturally do. Like it has to be an intentional thing that's either we're nudged towards or we develop some type of habit of reflection. And so in the workplace, if we like, sometimes we'll do this like mandatory postmortem where we're going to go and like, hey, we finished this thing, but what went well, what didn't go well? So that's a nudge towards helping people become more competent in reflection. And then I think storytelling is a step up from this, really being able to sort of unpack an experience, talk about like what were the primary needs that we were addressing in this project, what are the obstacles we faced along the way, and what are the insights that we came to at the end, right? Because needs, complications, and insights are the three core building blocks of good storytelling. And once people become more competent with that, they start being able to like unpack their experiences in much more proactive ways and getting a lot more meaning out of the experience that they wouldn't had they not stopped. So can you build in nudges to promote reflection and then help people understand how to reflect more effectively? Mm-hmm. So that would be an example of an experiential competency.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to this hierarchy that you have around memorable, meaningful, and transformative. And We're talking about meaningful work here. And so you say that meaning is ultimately about learning. Why? Why is meaning about learning?
I think from an identity perspective, there has to be some type of connection with who you are as an individual. Things can evoke emotion that we don't have to have connection with. You could know nothing about a particular sporting event, but see some amazing play or end of a game and be like, wow, that was really exciting, which is fine, right? Like that's great. But if we want it to really be meaningful, there has to be some type of connection with who we are, how we view the world, maybe even a connection that challenges how we view the world, then nudges us to either feel like, yeah, this is a reinforcement of this aspect of my identity, or no, I'm going to change something. I'm going to change something up. I was just reading a paper today that sort of took this from a like a philosophical perspective and talked about how we're either experiencing existential anxiety where we sort of come to this realization of like, who am I? What's my purpose in the world? Or existential authenticity where we sort of come to peace, right? And there's usually this like bouncing back between those states as we go through life. And so how do we then design experiences that offer opportunities for some existential anxiety? Like you've always felt like your job should be done this way, but here's someone who does it differently. And like, is that okay? How do you feel about that? And so I think the meaning is derived as we either reinforce or challenge our assumptions, values, beliefs, norms, right? And if those aren't challenged or reinforced, or there's not some type of like reflection on that, I think it just stays at sort of a memorable level.
Makes me think of going through coaching training. One of the models that we talked about is that the goal of a coaching session is often about deepening learning or forwarding action. And just in terms of the ways in which you create the hierarchy, maybe it starts with the learning and then the transformation is about forwarding the action.
Yeah.
That's the thing that comes next.
Yeah, because you can get people to do things, right? Especially from a managerial perspective, right? With just sort of like oversight and threats or rewards, right? Once those rewards or threats are removed from the table, behavior usually like returns back to sort of normal, unless somebody's really internalized a higher meaning for doing the thing that they want to do.
Are there other benefits of moving up that hierarchy? So, getting people to, I guess, intrinsically want to do the things that you want them to do might be one way of thinking about this experience design. But at the individual level, what's the value of going from memorable to meaningful to transformative?
Yeah, so I'll sort of back up and come at it from a different angle. So Joe Pine and Jim Gilmore wrote a book in the late 90s called The Experience Economy, where they made this claim that we were going to see, we progressed from sort of from a manufactured goods and then delivered services economy. And they said, well, really, it's going to be staged experiences that are going to be this next wave. And they talked about service economy. It was time well saved. And the experience economy was going to be time well spent, as opposed to paying somebody to do something that I don't want to do. I'm going to pay to spend my time in a particular way. And then towards the end of the first version of their book that came out in like 1999, they had some articles before that. They talked about what we'll probably see after the experience economy, or an extension of the experience economy, will be the transformation economy, where we'll go from staged experiences to guided transformation. And the catchphrase being time well invested, that you are looking for ways to then use your time to invest in the personal transformation. And I think work is a great context to think about. We may be a manufacturing company. We exist in the production of goods. That's where we derive our economic offering. But we could be in the transformation economy for our employees with this mindset of, what if employees felt like coming to work wasn't only to receive a wage, but to also feel like they're investing time in themselves and becoming better, whether that's functionally in their job or there's other things that they're able to develop. And so I think the benefit, Joe and Jim also talk about the fact that as you progress up this economic, this idea of economic progression, that people are willing to then pay more for their classic example are coffee beans. You pay a certain amount. ground coffee, you pay a little bit more. A cup of coffee, you pay a little bit more. And then Starbucks cup of coffee. This is their classic example. That people are willing to pay more for that added value that comes from moving up that chain, right? And so I think at the experience economy level, a lot of staged experiences are going to be in that more memorable realm, right? It's like, oh, I just want to like entertain me. I think is an oversimplistic view of looking at that. And we all love to be entertained, but there's a difference between going to a movie that's sort of a summer blockbuster and like, oh, that was fun, 2 hours, right? As opposed to going to a movie and then finding yourself thinking about it like afterwards, like, wow, I never like that. Just sort of, I didn't understand that period of history or what this story between these families, or you find this like personal relevance. Like I would go back and see that again, right? I'm not going to see Transformers 14 again, but I'm going to go and like I would see this thing again, right? And so I think people are humanly interested in progression. And that's why when we can like move to that transformational economy space or transformative experiences, it becomes much more engaging and potentially like economically beneficial, depending sort of how you're engaging in that space.
There was something that you said right here at the beginning of when we started speaking about the idea that all experiences are fundamentally co-created. And that idea kind of struck me as a very important idea, potentially, in terms of the way that we think about the design of meaningful work. That if all meaningful work experiences are co-created, what does that mean in terms of the way in which we think about the design of extraordinary employee experience? So I don't know. Yeah. Do you have thoughts about that?
Sure. Yeah. I think if we think about design from a perspective of human-centered design, that it's not just a designer sort of sitting in their workshop, coming up with something and then delivering it to the adoring public, but it's this two-way iterative interaction between someone or a group of people trying to solve a problem or create an opportunity for another group of people. And it's solved by conversations back and forth. First, understand like what is the underlying need, and then testing solution, whether we're thinking about rapid prototyping or lean processes or design thinking. I mean, it's the same version of trying to iteratively solve a problem, which inherently is co-creative. So if people are able to adopt that mindset, and there's lots of research to show that the more diverse group of people are trying to solve problems, the more solutions you're going to come up with. And the key to having a good solution is just to come up with a lot of solutions, right? There's a great book that came out a year or two ago called Idea Flow that sort of talks about this idea. Like the key business metric is, are you able to come up with a lot of ideas? And so if in the workplace, we find more opportunities for co-creation and collaboratively solving problems or designing work, it just increases the likelihood that we're going to get someplace that is going to work better than where we currently are, right? And as we talked about with co-creation of experiences, once we just recognize that from a paradigm perspective, it changes how we go about trying to solve problems, right? If something's not working, we don't just come in as if we have all the answers. We're going to talk to people. We're going to go back and forth. The other layer of the experience map that I usually talk about, we've got the touch points and then the reactions. But then I also like to think about, okay, who and what are the front and backstage contributors for each touch point? So at this touch point of the work experience, what are the people and things that employees are working with directly? And then who and what are backstage? Because then it allows us to say, okay, this touch point isn't working. If we look at our front and backstage contributors, here's our team who we need to work with to make it. Those are the people we need to talk with to solve this. Or maybe something is like, this part of the work experience is awesome. Okay, who's involved? How can we learn from them and spill it over? So if the attitude is just more collaborative, I think it just increases the likelihood that we can more effectively do what we're trying to do.
It strikes me as interesting. I was looking at a paper recently that was looking at systemic changes to organization and their relationship to well-being. And one of the key things in this paper is that at the end of the day, if you want to understand the two most important drivers of change in organizations for the purpose of well-being, it's can you increase employee voice and can you increase a sense of control within the environment? There's no better way to be able to increase a sense of voice and increase a sense of control than co-creation, co-creation of the very experience of work itself. The more that we give people the opportunity, and perhaps not everyone wants those opportunities. Some people just really do want to be told what to do.
Yeah.
But by and large, if we can give those experiences to people, it can be truly transformative.
Oh, yeah. And it checks those boxes. It increases autonomy, increases sense of competence, and people feel heard, and it connects with relatedness, right?
Yeah, you do it together. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. And a human centered design coupled with an experience design process I mean, it's just embedded in that, right? It has to be co creative. And just getting to that point organizationally, even if that's the experience centric as you get, is just having that mindset of like, we're going to solve these problems collaboratively with the people that we have to work with. Yeah, that's a really great place to start.
I'm going to open up a whole giant topic that perhaps we don't have time to be able to get into, but this question is making me think of it. We just talked about the fact that, some people are going to really want to be able to enter into that co-creation project, but other people are not. Other people might not want to be at work at all. Some people might want to be doing their own thing. And I know that, they just see work as a vehicle to be able to, in a more utilitarian way, get to be able to do the thing that they actually want to be able to do in their life, whether that's leisure, whether that's family, whether that's something else. And I know that you've spent a lot of time thinking about the relationship between work and leisure and the ways in which we blend those things. I think, these days we talk a lot about work-life balance, work-life synergy, work-life optimization, work-life,
Harmony.
whatever.
Yeah. All of the
Harmony.
terms. All,
We can't actually get to it because none of it is, it's ultimately like what could be effective for the individual, I guess, at the end of the day. But
totally.
maybe I'd love to just hear a little bit about some of the ways that you've been thinking about the kind of the one size fits none of that challenge.
Yeah. The problem with averages, right? So I think one of the biggest insights that I've had over the last 5 years or so is just I keep coming back to how important needs identification is when we're designing experiences. And part of I started teaching a class in the honors program here at BYU called The Art of Transformative Storytelling with my good friend Jamin Rowan, who's an English professor, because we both just saw storytelling as this really important problem solving competency. It was just interesting in this class as we sort of started diving into the literature and thinking about how we wanted to teach people about storytelling, how much of it came back to like good stories are about very specific needs. If you've got a story that sort of like doesn't feel grounded and it just doesn't quite make sense, usually the problem is always, well, there's not like a compelling need that this story is built upon. And I just see that like popping up in so many places. Like, oh, if we just understood the need better here, we could design a better experience. There's probably an apocryphal quote from Albert Einstein that if he had an hour to save the world, he'd spend 59 minutes trying to understand the problem, and then he'd go about solving it. And so back to what you were saying, if we don't understand and at least try to do a little bit of work to understand what not just the service level needs of our employees are, because we all have functional needs of like, I need money so I can buy food and have shelter. And we all have these functional needs, but to be curious enough to say, okay, yes, that's true, but why else do you choose to work here? And why do you like this aspect? And why do you not like this aspect? And usually in the design world, there's this idea of asking 5 whys and just continuing to sort of dig deeper and dig deeper. And usually you get down to this place where you're like, oh, okay, we're all sort of in the same place when it comes to like, yes, we want to be paid. Like, that's why we're here. But as we dig down and see these nuanced differences between people, that's when I think you can really start doing some cool stuff. It doesn't mean that you can, and sometimes people will feel like, oh, this is overwhelming. Like I can't customize the work experience to everybody. But there's also this inclusive design principle is if you design for the one, you solve for the many. And the classic example of this is that most public buildings are going to have automatic buttons to open doors because they have to, because of the American with Disabilities Act, right? They have to have these accessible spaces, but we all use those buttons. Maybe you're carrying something and you need to open the door, or you're pushing a stroller, or you don't want germs on your hands, so you use your elbows or whatever. So they've done this thing that was not meant to be used by everybody. It was for this particular group. And so if employers take the time to really believe in employee voice, to really try to understand where people are coming from, they're gonna have insights along the way that may emerge from an individual, but will often benefit and connect with other people in the organization. It's just like your people are this source of potential information. And for me, it's my students, right? I've become more and more open and proactive and curious about the students' experience in my classes because I just learn from them. Because I'm like, oh, I thought you were getting this out of the experience, but you're not. I'm going to tweak this thing, or that's a great idea. I'm going to do this. And sometimes you push back too, but it also gives you space to be able to say, well, we're doing this because of these reasons. And that allows them to sort of understand your needs a little bit better too. So I just think having conversations about needs and being curious enough is super, super important.
I'm going to make a plug right now for the Surgeon General's Framework for Mental Health and Wellbeing in the Workplace, because it is one of the things that I really love about what that team has created is that it is so fundamentally based on needs. It kind of talks about 5 different pillars, and most of those pillars are very common pillars within positive psychology or within well-being frameworks. But every single one of those 5 pillars is a balancing point between 2 needs. And I feel like you can get so much mileage about sitting down and having conversations with people about what is actually important and exploring those needs, because you do start to recognize that there's a tremendous amount of variation, but there's also a tremendous amount of commonality too when you start doing that. And I think it's the only way to go.
Oh, totally. And no matter how like intentionally empathetic you try to be, if you're not having conversations with the people that you're designing experiences for, we just shift back to our perspective. It's just natural, right? And so we continually have to like, okay, let's go back. Let's talk. Let's try to make sure we're on the same page, that I'm really understanding where you're coming from, that the way that we're designing this, or this isn't just like a one-off, check the box. We did employee voice. We're good to go. It's got to be cyclical.
We've talked about a lot of different things. Help us kind of land the plane. You were going to say, here are the most important principles to live by when it comes to making sure that you are helping to create a meaningful work experience for employees. What might they be? What were those key design principles maybe?
So I think, first of all, you've got to be really intentionally curious. And I read a book called The Wonder Switch a number of years ago, and it talks about this idea of genuine versus counterfeit curiosity, and makes this claim that because of the ubiquity of information and the internet and now generative AI, we're just used to be able to get answers really quickly. And that's like counterfeit curiosity. Genuine curiosity is being willing to be uncomfortable and admit you don't know things and engage in conversations, really try to understand. I think that's probably the most important thing when it comes to designing experiences, is that you're curious about the people you're designing experiences for. And then you're willing to co-creatively, iteratively work on that experience. And as we talked about before, that curiosity can manifest itself in trying to map out the experiences that you're interested either in redesigning or designing. And I think that's a great place to start, of just saying, like, what's a time-bound experience at work that I would like to redesign? Maybe it's a weekly meeting, and just start, okay, what are the components of this meeting? Not just during the hour that we're there, but what are the touch points that lead up to it? What are the touch points afterwards? And then talk to the people during the meeting. Does this encompass your experience? And how do you feel across these different touch points? Okay, this one seems to be a pain point. Let's talk more about this. What could we do to tweak this? Let's prototype it and try this next time. And just that process of engaging curiously, mapping out, visualizing the experiences, and then sort of scientifically almost prototyping different tweaks to see what works and what doesn't work, and just iteratively engage in that cycle.
Matt, I'm positively buzzing from this conversation with so many ideas about what's possible in the workplace. You have not failed to disappoint. You have made this an extraordinary session. Thank you so much for your wisdom, for your excitement, for your curiosity about what is possible in the workplace, for helping us think about what is not only meaningful but also transformational. I'm so grateful.
No, thank you. Thanks for being a great host and questions. And it's been really a delight chatting.
Is there, by the way, anywhere that you would recommend people go if they want to learn more about experience design?
Well, I'll shamelessly plug my own book, Designing Experiences, and just say that there are, some books that I mentioned already. Idea flow isn't necessarily experience design centric, but I think its fundamental ideas are really connected. I think Experience Economy is a great sort of foundational read of just why we're in this experience moment. I also really love Chip and Dan Heath's Power of Moments, which is a great read. They talk about sort of 4 particular types of experiences. The reason that Bob Rossman and I wrote our book is we felt like there were a lot of great offerings in terms of highlighting and case studies about good experience design and the importance of experience design. But there wasn't just one place to go that would articulate a process of how you did this. So it's great to know Zappos and Ritz-Carlton and Apple and these big flashy companies with lots of money do amazing things when it comes to experiences. But like we wanted to be able to articulate, okay, well, like what's a process that I can engage in to try to more intentionally think about experiences. So those are some potential resources.
Those are excellent starting points. Thank you again, Matt.
Thank you. It's been great.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about Eudaimonic by Design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.